Welcome to Talk Design Podcast, the space where creativity meets conversation. I'm Adrian Ramsey, your host, and as someone deeply entrenched in the world of design, I'm thrilled to introduce you to the minds that inspire me in the hope that they will spark something special within you too. From a design past crafting women's swimwear to pushing the boundaries of performance sportswear, from mountaineering to international yachting, to implementing systematic innovation solutions that transcend boundaries in aerospace industry. My heart remains rooted in architecture, and exploring the emotional tapestry woven by built spaces is my fascination. My journey in design has been what can only be described as a life of design. I want to thank you for lending me your ears. I'm eager to embark on this next episode together. And for those of you who prefer to watch and listen, you can catch this episode at YouTube. That's youtube.com/@TalkDesignPodcast. My guest on Talk Design today is the one and only Peter Stutchbury. Now, Peter, for those of you who don't know him, which was probably fairly rare, but for the American audience, they may not all know him. He would be one of Australia's top architects. And I say that he would have been one of Australia's top architects for most of his architectural career. So many awards that I'm not even going to go into that. He's the most amazing thinker, incredible designer, based in Sydney, but works all over Australia and beyond. And I've had the pleasure of meeting him before and spending some time with him. And Peter, I want to welcome you to the show.
Thank you.
Peter, can I start off with a couple of simple little ones, which is at some point you were a little boy running around. How did you even discover that architecture was a thing? Obviously highly creative, highly analytical, but where did architecture come into your picture as a kid?
In those days, which is some time ago, the word architecture was rare. It wasn't a common word, particularly in Australian culture. But I was made aware of technology through my father, who was an engineer, a very good engineer, and my uncles who were builders. Mm-hmm. And on my father's side, furniture makers as well. We spent much of our childhood outside, not inside, as is the habit today. And we were either making billy carts and racing them, climbing trees and making tree houses, swings in trees, hikes down to the national park and through the river, mustering sheep. So most of our time was spent outdoors, unknowingly learning from nature, but observing it because we are, as humans, natural observers. And slowly, over decades of living, learning how it interrelates and communicates. So my education, I'd say, was maybe 65% external, and the rest was traditional education.
And at what point did you go, I'm going to be an architect then? Because you could have gone and been a builder. You could have gone and been...
I was a builder. I'd worked as a builder after studying architecture. But, I think that anyone who is searching, of which, most people are at some stage of their lives searching, you're asking yourself the question, who am I? And it's a worldwide question. And it's a very generous question to have to answer. And I never felt a slot for that. I could never accommodate any particular knowing as my line of thinking or my awareness. I drifted around engineering, but it was too technical for me. I had a mathematical way of seeing things, but not a repetitive way of seeing things. I thought about, I alluded to things like marketing that had a sort of generosity in terms of expression, self-expression, and graphics, but none of them had the depth that I felt was necessary in order to sort of fulfill your life, really.
That's pretty interesting.
So
And I could,
as a word or as a profession architecture as a word came very late to me. In a sense, I was very misguided in my secondary education. I didn't pay attention and I didn't give it much authority in terms of my formal education, which was at the time the best I could do. I didn't have good concentration as a student. I was always imagining other things, which turned into a benefit in the end. But so, and I suspect this haunts many people, that formal education isn't a gratifying or rewarding process. Whereas once you step into, say, informal education, it can become quite expressive, self-expressive. So at the end of school, I really was a surfing bum at the end of the day and managed to sort of scrape into university, but not in architecture.
Right.
In fact, I hadn't even nominated architecture on my form, but I got into a course in commerce and I had to hitchhike back from Grafton on the north coast of New South Wales, where I was surfing, to register at New South Wales University. I stood in the queue for 2 hours and I got to the front of the queue and this little old lady looked up at me and I wish I'd kept her name, and she said to me, "So, young fella, what are you going to do for the rest of your life?" And I looked at her and I said, "Not bloody commerce."
I wonder if she tells the same story. Oh, Peter, we just froze. Let me just check the time. Have I got you? 35. I got you, Peter. It just froze at this end. Peter. 15. Cool. Yeah, go.
So my response to her was, "Not bloody commerce." And I turned around and there was a long table behind me, immediately behind me, and it had piles of books on it.
Yep.
And I picked up a light green book and opened it, and it had a series of occupations. Accounting was the first and architecture was the second.
Thank God you didn't choose the first one, hey?
Yeah, well, it was more that the second, the word architecture just sort of bled out at me.
Yeah, right.
And I thought to myself, why has no one told me about architecture? Why haven't I been exposed to that word? And I said, that's all I can do. That's my destiny, if you like. I can't do anything else.
Yeah.
And so I just set about doing architecture. It's very important to also contribute to that conversation by saying everything up to that point I now realise had its effect on architecture. So, being brought up a lot of the time out in semi-arid desert, where you have to learn to read the landscape and understand animals and understand the process of gathering animals and moving them through landscape, you become very attentive to the markers of landscape and the markers of weather. So unknowingly, I was gathering all this information which was going to assist me in my perception of architecture and my interpretation of how to make architecture. So it really was no surprise when I read that word and went shit, that's
me.
it. Yeah.
That's, I know from that walk that I was laughing to myself before, that walk we did at Tokal Lodge. And when we found that can tied at the big old 44-gallon drum tied in the trees, and I was trying to ride it like a bronco. But that walk probably shifted so much of my observing what we were talking about as we walked, as that group of us walked all around the site. And that thing of very much you being of the land, and just, that total awareness of, it's like a subconscious awareness. It's like, it's a survival awareness. It's like, how does this work? And I think that I'd like to think it's something that people can be trained in, and I'm sure there are markers that can be. But I also think that in your upbringing, it was so innate that it meant the difference between, a cow or a sheep or whatever, dying or living, being aware of those things, and also your own, not necessarily safety, but your own well-being in that environment. And then looking, at how light falls and looking at all those different things and listening to it and smelling it and getting, I always go when we do a project and it's in the country, well, where's a builder, not a builder, sorry, where's a farmer we can talk to? Let's talk to a few farmers and find out what happens here with the weather.
There's a point at which the child becomes civilized as we know it.
Mm-hmm.
And by civilized, I mean they start to identify with things like parents' authority, traffic lights, that sort of stuff, right? They start to prioritize that, or expectations. They start to prioritize that over intuition. So they start to prioritize it over the automatic and unautomated response to a problem. So, for instance, if you give a child a blank canvas and ask them to paint the sky, there's a point at which that painting becomes a repetition of the sky. But up to that point, it's an interpretation of the sky. And that point varies for every person. What I think was fortunate for me is that point drifted well into adolescence and beyond. There was no point in which my education overtook my intuition. And that for me is a really interesting social shift, because now I think that time, that age in people is getting lower and lower because of the way we're being educated through technology. And recently I saw a graph on mental illness, which is showing enormous 30-40% increases in children's mental illness. And I'd say the answer is very logical. It's the computer. If you have no real innate human skills, that is, skills to identify danger, skills to identify friendship and other, skills to identify change in patterns, then you're going to feel very susceptible as soon as you walk outside the door. You're safe inside, but you're unsafe externally. And so we're seeing a huge international shift in the way people perceive the world, the way people perceive their position in the world. And houses are responding to that by becoming more normalised. They're not responding by becoming more radical.
Yeah, interesting.
When I say more normalised, I mean if you pick up any magazine, you will find a repetition of thinking going on. And that repetition of thinking is all about safety. It's all about all sorts of safety. It's about safety. It's about not standing up from the pack.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
when we were kids, we could be radical, and the time that it took to find out that we were radical could vary anything between 10 minutes and 10 weeks.
Yep.
Because no one discovered that we'd actually broken that window by throwing a cricket ball out, or no one actually found out that
What
we
you
had
did.
been. Yeah. These days, you're discovered pretty much straight away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You get your opportunity to be radical has been reduced significantly, and therefore, without that training, if you like, or without that opportunity, or without that perception, it's disappearing.
Well, this takes me down so many bloody paths in my brain. Like there's this great homogenization of architecture globally. And I kind of blame it on the internet to some degree because of the fact that everything can be seen by everybody. But I can go to Wyoming and see a house that I could see in Sydney, that I could see in South Island of New Zealand or the North Island of New Zealand, or I could see it in India if somebody wanted to build it there. It's the house is the house is the house. Are they beautiful houses? Absolutely, they're beautiful houses. There's no question about it. But the style of it is the house is not necessarily adapted. I don't know if that's the right word, but adapted for the landscape.
And it's not just the landscape. The landscape is critical because it informs, or it can inform, a building.
Mm-hmm.
It's people as well.
Mm.
You know, the white person came to our country and ignored a social etiquette.
Yep.
that it already existed.
Mm-hmm.
And we're now trying to sort of claw that back,
Mm-hmm.
having learned that it deserves respect.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, in the 1960s, every country was, or almost every country was self-sustainable in water and food. And as a consequence, it had its own culture. It didn't need to seek other cultures in order to survive. It had its own culture. Now that the world is interdependent, cultures are disappearing. And it's cultures that brings awareness to place, and it's cultures that brings awareness to people. And so, yes, place is critical and always has been. And my great teacher, Uncle Max Dulamanman Harrison, was a better teacher about place. But then on the other hand, my great mate Rick LaPasture understands, he can see culture. He can find culture. And that also, and I believe Utzon had the ability as well, that allows you then to design with really clear parameters on how you think about something, not random ones, not like that's a really good material and that'd look good against that, with that sort of, not like that at all. But that the idea comes from an understanding, but a commitment to that understanding. Not just the understanding, but actually saying, that's what I believe benefits our work. And that's why we stay with designing houses to a large degree, because it's much easier to find a client, a family that will support that thinking, than it is to find a commercially orientated client that supports that thinking.
A corporation or a government department. Yeah.
However, having said that, we're working on 3 public buildings at the moment that falling in that category of deep thinking, and we have to try and hold on to it. which is hard work.
So your great mate, Marlon Blackwell, who I had the pleasure of interviewing with Artie, as well as being at his home and spending some time with him recently, he must struggle with the same. He does public and he does, private or, residential homes and stuff as well. Does he start, do they struggle with the same thing? Is everybody struggling with that same thing? Like the reason, well, one of the things, you said about the radical, and I totally get that. I think I grew up a lot like you, maybe with more expectation around some things, but I grew up outside. I grew up on farmland. We didn't own a farm or anything, but I grew up with a creek in my backyard. I was building dams. I was making swings. I had hundreds of hectares of hills to run around in that were covered in, gorse and sheep and horses, and we'd steal horses to ride, and, we'd do all those things. We'd build.
That's the sort of thing I'm talking about, stealing horses to ride.
Yeah.
Boy, was it an adrenaline adventure.
Yeah.
The adrenaline adventures these days are very limited.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
And they don't define the person at all. 3-day trip through his landscapes with him in the car, playing the Rolling Stones, non-stop, because we're both followers.
Yeah.
Desperate followers. He's probably a little bit more than I, but and the way we appreciated place in particular, he took me to places that amplified the way he manages his architecture, puts it together, thinks about it, creates it, invents it. And we went to like little cafes on the side of the road with wonderful traditional, Ozark cooking, and these things had been found and discovered by Marlon and put into his catalogue of priorities in terms of his approach to life and design. And that was a great trip. And it was all about the differences in life and the intrigues of life. He took me to a landscape, for instance, a swamp that was just, to the passerby, it was just a swamp. But once he explained it, it was the most beautiful element in the landscape. So I find that great architectural thinking comes hand in hand with patience, with observation, and with the ability to translate, not just, that it's a pond, but what it contributes in terms of its position in the landscape. That is, is it the starting pond? Is it the finishing pond? Is it a pond that cleans the water? Is it a pond that just catches? There's a whole story, and architecture should be the same. You should be able to ask any architect about their building and there be a story to explain it. And that story could go on for a long time. E.g., the story of falling water that we talked about before.
Yep.
That is a book, the story of falling water. I've told you 3% of what I know about falling water.
Yeah.
So, good architecture has stories.
I think because it's so thoughtful, there's something else that you said earlier as well about, you were saying about you wrote something poetically to someone that you were talking about. And I wrote it down because you have a real thoughtfulness with words, as well as like that same thoughtfulness with landscape, land, environment, and history of plays a big part in that. And then on the flip side of all that observation and carefulness, you've got a radical monster that goes, well, I really want to create this kind of part of it. This is how I want to express that in this landscape or in this place. And this is why the story matters to get you there. I was at a lecture that Frank Harmon did, and he was just talking about so much about writing the words that became the design, I suppose, ultimately of something, and writing the story, creating the story before he creates the architecture. He doesn't create the architecture and then go back and make a story for it. And I think you're saying the same thing, as you've got a developing story before you draw or before you actually go there. But it's a very considered journey. Like you were saying with Frank Lloyd Wright, that was he'd had that building in his mind. He'd built it and designed it over and over and over and over to be on that spot in his mind. And then it was just execution of the design. It was just an execution of that vision of what it should be.
See, I think the story already in part exists whenever you start an architectural project. There's a story already there. And we really are the crafters of how that story develops. And if the story that we develop has connections with the old story, then it's a much better read. Well, potentially it's a much better read because it has history, it has logic, it has information, it has connection.
Mm-hmm.
So what we as a practice and as a group of thinkers, how we work is we try and understand the stories, be them cultural or climatic or weather patterns or geology or whatever it is. And we study the stories a lot. And as you've said before, perhaps our reaction to those stories comes very quickly, or perhaps it takes a lot of time to draw that out. And sometimes that's dependent on the urban landscape and its intensity or density or distraction. But sometimes it's simply trying to find the truth. And that's sort of a lifetime ambition, really.
Yeah.
The refinement of truth. Good luck with that.
Well, it's a journey, isn't it? Hopefully each step you take, you come closer.
Yeah, but it's a journey that should not just benefit yourself.
No.
It's a journey that is a social journey, and we have responsibilities to society to share whatever society is willing to listen to.
So with that, have you come across Thomas Heatherwick's book, Humanize? Have you?
Haven't.
No? You'd probably enjoy it, but Thomas Heatherwick from the UK is just, it's been out a little bit now, but it's a book called Humanize, and it's all about how buildings mentally affect people who walk past them and mentally affect people who are in them, and landscapes of buildings do that, and what cities are like. And anyway, it's a bit controversial. I've listened to it. I haven't read it. I've listened to it on an audiobook and really enjoyed just the broader thinking of it, and the facts that he's got data on, what happens for people's emotions at different points and whether it brings joy or doesn't bring joy. And, and then
we have in Sydney a prime example of that sort of translation of architecture, which is the Opera House. When it was first proposed and built, I'd say 95% of the population were up in arms. In fact, Utzon got thrown out because the population supported that. But now, well, you'd be battling to find 3% who don't love it. Now, what's the reason for that? Why has social ambition and interrogation shifted so much to now building? And it's because the building has proven itself over time. And quite often architecture has to do that. It has to prove itself over time. They have an award called the 25-year award, which is nothing in terms of the history of this country.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, in terms of architecture and the modern world, it's 25 years. Can a building survive and still be respected after 25 years? And so, I think our attitude to architecture is not grounded in strongly enough in, dare I say it, the history of the world. That is, how many people are designing buildings to last 400 years? We all should be doing that. I mean, everyone knocks down buildings and they're 30 years old throughout the world.
It's a crime.
I mean, you go to Italy and they restore all their hill villages. They don't knock them down. And although it's difficult to produce a new architecture out of that, it's incredibly sustainable as a cultural, as history, but also financially, economically, it's viable. So, this integration that I'm talking about, integral thinking that I'm talking about, is not just place and people and culture, it's time. And I think time is the huge difference in architecture, the word time. How do we view a build, like, again, looking at the Opera House, that is timeless.
Yes.
And the way it's constructed is also timeless. It potentially can last to eternity. And because it's respected and beautifully designed, it also has potential to last or outlast. But there are many buildings that aren't done like that, well, most buildings. And so, how do we value that?
Well, look at if you had the
word architecture.
Yeah, if you had to put a price on the Opera House, it would be, forget what it would cost to build it again today, forget what it cost to build it at the time. It is as iconic a symbol of Australia as the kangaroo. And if you had to put a price on making a kangaroo, you'd be up for a lot of money. I mean, it's not a price, it is this thing. And the Opera House is, what was it? Was it commissioned in the 60s or something? And when you look at it, as you said just then, it's timeless. It has a story. It has a story of its place. It has a story of its, of its whole being. And
did you know that point of land where the Opera House is was once the biggest midden on Sydney Harbour? Shells.
Really?
Yeah, shells on shells.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Wow.
Very interesting. Anyway, there you go.
I go, so could every building be that iconic, but every building be that thoughtful? And every building could be that thoughtful, but maybe not that iconic.
Every building, that was a man of genius. But every building could have that attitude. And that's where, in my opinion, there's been a major shift in our culture, in all cultures. I walk every morning, and this morning I was walking and I walked past a 1960s Pettit and Sevitt building, which is a sort of, and it wasn't prefab, but it wasn't sort of one-off either. But it was an interesting style at the time. And I thought to myself, that attitude to architecture doesn't exist now, which is making buildings for the general public that aren't repetitive and identical, but can be modified and changed and adapted according to an individual's perception of what they need. Like you used to be able to do with cars. You could customise cars. In the 60s, I remember my father coming home with a pamphlet where we could customise the seats, we could customise the colour, we could customise everything. And you had your own car, it was beautiful. That's all gone.
Yeah. So in that we have as humans, we have maybe I should just use the word I have a yearning to always have something that is customized, that is, I suppose, about me. And I certainly know with my clients, it's often about them. And your clients, I would say, it is a huge motivating driver to be understood by you and you understanding them, and then whatever you create is a journey for them, but it is about, as much about the landscape and everything else, it's still about them, because you're observing them and how those things will be and how they will be living in that home. And I go that want of customization, companies are trying to get to a point of, oh, can we give people customization, because otherwise everybody's got the same, and yet they're trying to spread themselves all around the world with the same thing. So it's kind of such a conundrum that, how do you be in both spaces at once?
There's an interesting project we're doing at the moment called Dimensions X.
Yep. Oh, yeah. I love this project. Mm-hmm.
And I have a great partner, Oscar Martin and Alejo in the office, who really are the drivers behind the project. But a 3-bay building,
mm-hmm.
so prefabricated, planet-friendly 3-bay building, has 729 configurations. Now that hasn't been done before in prefabricated building, but what it does is it takes you all the way back to that pamphlet that you got with the old Holden,
yep,
which was customize your Holden.
Yep.
And it allows people, if you go onto the website, you've got a configurator which allows you to choose and change, and as you do it, to see the price respond to that, mm-hmm. up and down, and in essence modify a standard product into what suits you. Now, that is our attempt, and we're developing that. We've produced 5 or 6 at the moment, but there's, we have orders, several orders, many orders actually. And what it is trying to do is understand the sort of the point at which architecture becomes easy. So architecture becomes easy for people to accept and belong with, as opposed to commission as a one-off piece. Mm. And a farmer will have their stud herd, but their stud herd will give their commercial flock reputation.
Right.
And in a way, this is our commercial flock.
Yeah.
Which is a product of the stud herd.
Mm. And with it,
and it's a very economical, small footprint, planet-friendly, carbon negative building.
And so in that, the idea would be that it can be built in any climate in Australia, or give or take?
It has modifications that adapt to all the climates.
Yeah.
And it's, it's becoming more and more appropriate. Mm. The more we do, the better, like anything, the better we're getting at it. We're into our, I think, 4th year now.
I'd like to thank Stetson Hats Australia for providing my amazing collection of open road Stetson hats. Since 1865, John B. Stetson has been crafting legendary headwear, adorning the heads of Western icons like Annie Oakley and George Custer. The open road hat debuted in 1937, beloved by artists, outlaws, presidents alike. Its timeless style fits the setting from city streets to open plains. Whether in the cab of a truck or my trusty Mini Cooper, the open road is all style. If you think hats aren't for you, you just haven't found the right one yet. Discover yours at stetsonaustralia.com or stetson.com if you're in the USA. Thanks, Stetson, for your support. Please share your Stetson moment by emailing me your photo to talkdesign@gmail.com. Let's celebrate the timeless allure of Stetson together. Yep.
So it's been developed over some time, and of course, all the thinking before that.
Yes,
is contributing to it. But that's shown me that the general public are interested in architecture, but don't have access to it financially, which is, which is not reasonable. What's reasonable is providing a product that is architecturally based, but financially affordable.
Yeah, but I've got on my notes here to ask you, like we have a country, and certainly America as well, where overbuilding is the brief, and yet the price of that keeps pushing it further and further out of most people's reach. But people will go, I hear it regularly, big is beautiful. When it comes to a house, big is beautiful. I'm like, big isn't beautiful. Like I don't necessarily always say that, but I go, tell me what big is, but like we came, I imagine you probably similar to me. I came from a house that had 3 bedrooms, 1 toilet, 1 bathroom, a kitchen, a living and a dining. And that was a good house because it had a separated kitchen, living and dining. The living and dining were not separate, completely separate rooms, but they were open to each other. But there was a separate space. You weren't just dining in your lounge room or in your kitchen. And it was really simple. There was no, what do you call it, like butler's pantries or attached garages or rumpus rooms or media rooms or saunas or spas. And I'm not saying people shouldn't have those things. I'm just saying it was a really relatively simple thing. And nowadays your average project home would have a butler's pantry, a media room, a ensuite, at least 3 bedrooms, probably a study. I don't know. I'm just trying to think. Probably 5 different dining areas. People don't need to eat that much in my thoughts. But anyway, that's beside the point. But there'd be an island bench. There'd be a breakfast nook. There'd be a formal dining table. There'd be an outdoor dining table. There's kind of like all
and
these.
Yet they go on a camping holiday and live in a tent. Same family.
Yep. Yep.
Like the first clients we had for this planet-friendly house.
Yep.
I went up to where they wanted to site the building, couple, probably a little bit younger than me.
Yep.
And I said, because it's a small footprint house.
Yeah.
I said, tell me what interests you or what's motivated you to move forward with this building? And they looked at me and they said, do you need much more? And I think that says it all, like what do we really need as humans in order to nurture our own progression in life, to nurture our family, to provide safety and security, but also education and beauty. And they said, which was also interesting, they said, the outside rooms are just as important as the inside rooms. And we'd gone up and orientated this building, so we made actually a series of 3 outside rooms to associate with the building. And in some ways, that's how the building was conceived. So it could operate with the landscape and external rooms and modify those 729 modifications. They're all about adapting to place.
Yeah.
So, hopefully that logic, which is don't spend your life fortune and retain a mortgage for 30 years on a building, spend it on education for your kids or your landscape.
Yeah, adventure. I'm
So it's a very interesting. It's an interest. It's been a very wholesome thing to be involved with.
I think it's wonderful. I think the fact that, your years of and your team's years of thinking, just the thinking, the consideredness that you put into a project like that is beyond, like most people would have, or most architects wouldn't have had the breadth of exposure or knowledge or depth of it, which your career's given you, and also your friendships, your the people that you are friends with. I remember you joining us on that podcast with Rick Joy. Again, this thinking levels, is oh yeah, it's elevated. It's people who are prepared to do the hard thinking or prepared to ask the hard question. You said that the who am I question, like, and it's a discovery question. And to go, okay, so you can own something that's that thoughtfully put together. Not only can you own it, if you can come up with what suits you in it, because there's 729 ways. If you can find 730, I'm sure that'd be accommodated, but it's probably well covered by the time that you get to 729, and that you can make it work for any land, and you can still keep it at an affordable build price, where we've got build prices that I suppose they are what they are. I was going to say they're extreme. They feel extreme because of what has changed in the last 3 to 5 years. That's where the extremity comes from, I think, as opposed to if that had been gradual over 10 years or 15 years, where everybody would have just kind of rolled along with it. But that whole COVID push and change makes it feel extreme. But it's certainly, when you look at the cost of building versus the cost of or the people's wages or their profits from companies and stuff, there's a shift. And I kind of look at what you're saying with this place, with Dimension X. I go, why wouldn't it be the first landing space of somebody who goes, I need a home, as opposed to just landing in a catalogue of facades and layouts that aren't even designed to space north, south, east, or west. There's no orientation in them. I'd rather see a landscape full of similar looking buildings. I mean, 729, that's a big subdivision to get one of each, but just of similar looking buildings and materiality that all worked with the environment and the land and weren't part of what I call the more economy. When you said,
if you travel through Africa,
yep,
by train, say, or by car, but we were hitchhiking at the time, you will come across villages, Kenya and south, that are repetitive buildings, but as you look at them, and then there might be 50 in a village,
yep,
but as you look at them, they look like a natural phenomenon. They look completely comfortable in their landscape. Social protocol, maybe the roof is higher in one because there's more people and more smoke, whatever it might be. But the repetition is incredibly beautiful. So too in Italian hill towns.
mm-hmm.
So too in northern Chinese villages, underground villages. There is nothing wrong with repetition. In fact, it's a quality of nature.
Mm-hmm.
Where it fails is where it doesn't understand or where it doesn't adapt. And as Darwin said, the animals that survive are the animals that adapt. And it's the same with, I think, with architecture. The architecture that survives is the architecture that adapts to its time, but also to its place and its people. So, which is what's been said before. So I think it could look quite beautiful.
Oh, me too.
Because there would be shifts in repetition dependent on the people, and the place remains the same. So there would be orientations that are similar. And because it's a smaller footprint, you get a bigger garden.
Yeah.
So when you read it from above, you read the landscape first and the building second, which should be a priority of us all.
Well, yes. Go back to we've got one earth, one air, one water. Absolutely, it should. And the overbuilding is certainly, it's like pushed to the square meterage limit of, not every block, but too often it's just pushed out to that square meterage limit instead of actually using the land.
Yeah, imagine this, right? At the moment, we have cheek to job buildings.
Yep.
And on all subdivisions. And so 900 to the boundary, 900 the boundary, 1800 between buildings. You don't really want to win there looking into another building. So that side of the house is gone. There's no benefit from that side of the house. Imagine if we made it like 3 meters off the boundary. So it was a 6 meter gap that would accommodate landscape and garden and smells and butterflies and insects and activity and life. Our planning guidelines are completely misguided. We have the same planning guidelines for a block of land on a hill and on a slope and on an escarpment as we do for ones on the beach. Exactly the same planning guidelines.
Yep.
It's
makes no sense.
So
that's homogenization again, isn't it? It's like it.
Yeah, it is. It's going back to where we started the conversation. But our most recent client for these buildings is buying 4 of them.
Yeah, right.
And I said, well, why don't you just commission a house? And he said, no, what appeals to me is I will assemble them. And I've been to see his land, a beautiful piece of land, but I'll assemble them to make the outside garden as important as the rooms themselves. And he said, I can lock 3 of them off and live in one. And I don't have to maintain them.
Yep.
They'll maintain themselves. Then I can open up when I have guests or I have the kids come to stay.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think of housing as a village, as opposed to thinking of it as a possession and a house,
or a castle.
It changes the whole way that you assemble buildings. Urban buildings, but also rural buildings.
Yeah. I think one of the things I love about rural buildings is so often they expand with need. And it's not always that they expand by just tacking onto the side of them. They'll, you build a shed over here, like you'll build a garage or whatever it is over there. You've got footprint that you can spread out on. And it's so different from, say, an urban lot. And I love the excitement of it because you end up with different looking buildings because they've got different purposes as opposed to all
and
buildings.
Different types.
Yeah. And different, I love that.
Their history, their catalogue of history.
Yeah.
Just recently, my cousin bought some more farm property, and I went to visit. There's a prefab which must be 10 years old. There's a sort of machinery shed which would be 30 or 40 years old, and there's the old original sort of garage workshop which would be 100 years old with the painted name of the property on the roof. And in that 2 hours I had there, I could read the history of that place in terms of when it was economically viable, when it went into stress, how many people lived there. It was, as I say, a catalogue of time.
Yeah, I love it.
And that's, architecture can be that too. Who designs buildings to be added to? I mean, we try and think of how a building can be added to in the future, even the big buildings, added to in the future or changed. I mean, this building I sit in, our own house, is designed to be 3 houses, 3 apartments.
Right.
So at the moment it's 1 house, but, you know, as time goes on, and the kids want to move back here, they can live in an apartment. So, you know, that ability to see architecture also as a resource is not, I mean, there are, I could name architects, say, in Melbourne that are doing it very well. But it's not commonplace because it's slightly more expensive and it requires a little bit more work.
It certainly requires a lot more thinking, or well, not necessarily a lot more, but it's that conscious thinking, isn't it? It's thinking with purpose, and
it's thinking about how that place will be lived in. As time goes on. So it's thinking about generational change. It's thinking about cultural shift. It's thinking about changing urban environments, and it's thinking about connection and survival, so that they become the sort of the base qualities of the building.
So the base qualities of all thinking is driven from.
Well, I think that if I look around this building, connection and survival, they sound like desperate words, not so much connection, but survival.
Survival does.
But it's not intended to be a desperate word. It's intended to be a base word. So a word from which the other words grow. So how does one survive, you know? How does one connect? And that becomes, again, the story of the architecture.
I go all houses or all homes, really there were 2 sort of primary functions because they were caves or whatever beforehand. One was shelter from the elements and the other was protection from either other humans or animals. And even to the point where, you know, like, I know going to Poland, they live with their, you know, like their house is attached to the barn and the barn's full of cows. You know, that kind of thing. And the chickens are living under the house and that's the chicken run, you know, outside there. Just that kind of very utilitarian kind of style of living that we have got ourselves so far from being connected to. And I don't know that everybody's going to jump up and down and go, cool, we want a barn with a cow in it and, you know, chickens living under the house. But that connectiveness to the reality of life, houses, and I think, I was going to say maybe driven by COVID, I'm talking about just in general. People humans
are animals of habit and animals of convenience. They don't like to put themselves in conditions of adversity. For instance, if you go to a farm, you can always find the animal camp. That is where they go to rest. And that's out of the weather, it's out of eyesight, it's safe in terms of predators, it's got all the qualities that allows them to relax. And at the end of the day, that is a sort of a submersive quality of the human, that they want to relax. They don't want to have tension. So connection starts to create tension because connection is awareness. So it's not for everyone, but what I did learn, one of the biggest lessons I had in architecture was from B.V. Doshi, the great Indian architect and one of the great humanists in the world and a personal dear friend, bless his soul. He said to me once, he looked at my work and I'd done a talk in his studio and there was 40 or 50 people there and I was feeling pretty chuffed, about being invited to do one. And Doshi looked at me and he said, "Peter, where's the dark?" And my immediate response was, "Oh, you can't photograph the dark, Doshi." But his point was excellent. his point was you need places to go to within a building, within an environment, within a landscape where you can relax, where you can shed the worries and the fears that we live with.
Yeah.
And you can be with yourself or be with your thoughts.
Yeah.
And that quality in architecture is so critical to the success of that architecture. And so, having been exposed to that bit of thinking, and of course, they do it hard to soft as you progress into the building. And I understood as soon as he said it, and then he showed us his own house, and I could understand it even further. But since that time, I've been very conscious of providing the variety of emotions that architecture should palette for any client and any opportunity.
Yeah. I think, yeah, that whole, I love that piece, Where's the Dark? Because, you know, that thing of, well, where's that space that allows people to be thoughtful? And what went through my mind when you were saying it was, does anybody have that anymore? Because they carry a mobile phone into every space, or some connectivity into every space. And going back through our conversation and talking about, you know, the mental health of people and this connectiveness to a device as opposed to a connectiveness to a landscape, or connectiveness to their own thoughts even, you know. I often say to my daughter, she'll show me some great video of surfing or whatever, and I'll go, but are you going to be a doer or a watcher? Which one are you going to be, hun? And she's like, well, I'm enjoying watching this. I said, yeah, but you don't have to do that. But are you going to be a doer or a watcher, an observer or a partaker in life? Because life's about partaking, and it gives you everything back if you partake. If you're just going to watch it.
I think that's what good architecture is too. It's a partaker. And you know, I'll never forget some of the stories Rick told of Woodson when he described a seat in a building in a landscape by saying something like, you walk to the seat, it's the middle of the day, you sit on the seat, the sun's coming across your back, so it's not glare, it's warmth. There are opportunities for people to walk in front of you, so you've got observation, yet there's landscape to the side, so you've got smell and you've got movement, and he would describe the experience in minute detail, which of course comes with experience, with that experience. So it's impossible to have that experience looking at a telephone. Yes. It's just those qualities can't be described. You can't describe the smells or the light or anything like that. All you can do is repeat the definitions. And so, you know, unfortunately, the phone, whilst it's an amazing, let's face it, you know, 50 years ago, this is an amazing product and helpful on so many levels, safety being one of them, or safety on one hand, but not on the other. It cannot, even AI, it cannot translate those qualities of smell and taste and hesitation, unpredictability, intuition, immediate response, deep thinking. It doesn't do those things. And as a consequence, the architecture that is produced by the computer, of which is large, cannot have that understanding. It just can't have that understanding. It's not an aggressive statement or a statement of contention. It's a statement of fact. And you can argue it, but it's the same as, you know, this people are writing books now with AI.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, people are going to become clever AI writers. But I suggest that if you pulled them aside and asked them what the story was, you know, what's the background, what was the research, what was the story, it wouldn't have nearly the thinking in it as, say, Tim Winton's Breath or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
You know?
Great reference to Winton's Breath. I'm with you. Somebody asked me the other day about AI. Was I nervous about what AI would do for architecture? And I said, no, not in the slightest. I said, you know, it will probably draw construction drawings at an incredible speed that we would never be able to get done before. It'll be able to understand every council regulation and every precedent, you know, like precedent that's been set, to know whether we're asking for something new or where the information is that we're going to take with us to log our relaxation. It's going to be it's a fantastic tool. At the moment, I can go into AI and I can go, oh, I need a house by the beach, da 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 da, and I can give it, you know, 3, 4, 5 lines and say, draw this in the style of Peter Stutchbury, and it will do that for me. You know, it will go, oh, I can say, do it as if Homer Simpson did it. It will do that one too. It's this thing, but it doesn't do. It's a amazing tool, incredible, but it's a mimic. It's a mimic of what it already knows and sees. And yes, it will get to a point where it will be data driven for more than that.
But it doesn't recognize opportunities.
Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't see the unseen.
Well, you know that thing when
it doesn't reveal.
Yeah. You sit with a client and you're sitting there and you're talking to them about the Rolling Stones, anything that's close to your heart, you know, and you see their face, whether they're interested or not interested, or whether it's something that they have a commonality in instantly. You see their eyes twinkle when you know, I say throw a bit of bait in the water and they go, oh, that's worth listening to, or that's a bit exciting. Or you'll see their nose slightly wrinkle when you suggest something that doesn't feel comfortable with them, you know, that it's outside of that wheelhouse. And I go, I don't know that AI will get there, but with something like Google Glass or Apple whatever, where it will be reading all this stuff and then it will be feeding it into you and you will be going, oh God, what does that mean? Or how does that mean it reacts? I think that it'll have its place, but I go, you know what, your place, my place, you know, lots of other people who draw houses, their places is in understanding the landscape and understanding the environment and understanding the people that want to live in it and how they want to live and how they generationally want to live beyond that.
I sort of, I have a parallel analysis where, you know, when you're mustering a huge paddock of sheep, you know, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 acres of virgin bushland, and you let them into the next paddock, 98% will follow the leader as it rushes into the next paddock, you know, and as they move off into the next paddock. And if there's a wind blowing, they can smell water or whatever. There'll be a small, tiny minority who go through the gate, and as long as someone's not on the other side, they'll stop and look around and walk over to shade and wait there until the heat of the day is gone, then make their move. And I often parallel that with society, that we're all rushing through the gate towards water, but not thinking really or not understanding what it means to survive. And what we need as humans to survive. So, you know, for me, this is all interwoven with how we produce architecture and how we think about the shelter for people in this country and beyond. and how we can make it in such a way that it continues in thousands of years of awareness.
I think it,
And
yeah.
fortunately, we now have the sort of the Indigenous content now to help manage all that, which is being enormously valued.
Yeah. I think that it's been ignored for not ignored, but just sidelined for, way too long. And all countries that were, I suppose, colonized, they lose so much in colonizing that they could have learnt from the people who already were here. And it's almost, they've got to heal it to go back to learn from them. And certainly I see the same in America, even Hong Kong. There's so many, cultural lessons, and you certainly get, I think, closer to some of those values when you're in countries like you were saying before, being, in a hilltop village in Italy or in Spain or, one of those places. There seems to be more of a value around life rather than just commerce. And your story with the sheep, I'm going, yeah, I got a T-shirt from Marlin which says radical, but it's spelt back to front. And so you can only read it as radical when you're in the mirror. And on the back of it has a bunch of his architectural pictures or silhouettes. And I was thinking of those sheep, and that you were one of them, obviously, with your hat on that you always got on outside, and that you would have been with your radical T-shirt on, sitting over beside the tree at the same time and going, yeah, let them go. Let's watch. Let's watch. Not at their detriment, just at their observation. And yeah, I like that. I know you're very conscious of time. I've got one last question. I want to ask you first, before I do it, Bondi Mermaids, the sculpture. If anybody hasn't seen this, go on Peter's Instagram and have a look at their submission for Bondi Mermaids. And I think it is, I've seen the other submissions and stuff, and I just think that it's the most wonderful piece of everything that you've kind of summed up with what we've just talked about. And the way it's got movement, the way it's got light, the way it reflects, and the way it's a story of place and of what happens there. So I'm hoping that that's the one that gets built.
Of course, that project, yeah, well, as are we. Of course, the big drivers in that project were Belinda Koopman and Lynn Utzon, Jorn Utzon's daughter.
Yeah.
And I think the council would be wonderfully elevated in terms of artistic installation or artistic benefit to community. I mean, Lynn is a remarkable artist, as too is Belinda, and between the two of them, that installation or that proposal for an installation, I think, is inspirational. I really do. And I think you've identified that. It's quite remarkable.
It is timeless, and it tells such a beautiful story without necessarily, it owns the space it's in, but it doesn't own everything. It's just a part of its space. There's something ethereal about something that's so solid, and yeah, it's I think it's beautiful, absolutely stunning. And I would, it's the kind of thing that I go, oh, it would engage you to discover, and it would engage you to tell the story.
Also, I think it allows people to think to that work.
Yeah, me too. Absolutely.
Not just experience, but to think.
Yep.
To think about all sorts of things.
Yeah.
I think it'd be most beautiful at sunrise.
Right. Yeah.
Because the light on the east side would be very different to the light on the west, and that was quite intentional.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, how do you create an elemental work of beauty that tells the similar stories to what you've been trying to tell? With quite different medium, really. Sculpture versus architecture.
Yeah.
Similar but different.
Yeah.
Very singular.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I wanted to bring it up. I think it's so beautiful, and I hope that they build it so that I can go and see it. It's that kind of thing.
So do we, but
get on to the council and vote.
Bit concerned about conservatism.
Well,
but
yes.
no, you can vote for it. So if anyone listens to the podcast and wants to, you can vote for that sculpture.
Yep. Go and vote for it. I have, and I did send it off to a few other friends and say, you can vote for any of these, but this is the one you need to vote for. My last question. You've got one last project. I asked this of just about everybody on the podcast. You've got one last project. After that, that's it. You're done. Architecture's done for you. You can't do another project. You can't talk about it. Can't influence anybody else. You can't tell somebody else to do an architectural project. It's your last thing. What would you choose and why?
There's 2 projects I'm doing at the moment that could easily fall into that category. One is a cultural building for the Maru people in the Gibson Desert, and it represents shared values. It represents, as best as probable, the understanding of place and cultural respect. And it does it in a way which redefines building in the desert to a degree. And I just feel it's hard work because there's no support for it, government at the moment. It's an initiative by community, and community aren't wealthy.
Yeah.
And everyone that's contributing is doing so pro bono at the moment. So the engineers and ourselves and the QS and the project manager in particular, which is amazing. But that's the belief in the project. And then the other project, which I was recently asked to do, is probably a single room adjacent off the grid on the south coast of New South Wales that introduces visitors to the landscape. So you go to this room and you can stay there before you take your walk through the national park. And I thought, it's a gateway. And I thought, what a wonderful opportunity is not the right word, what a wonderful position to be in, to try and imagine how best to introduce people to landscape. And these could be people from anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
So they're forced to walk 2 kilometres to get to this hut. They get to this hut. It's remote but in remarkable landscape. And then they can either do or depart from this hut, millions of years old. Now, that for me at the moment is a remarkable architectural story. So, and then, I think that's enough.
Yeah.
And I think both of those projects and we are very fortunate. We have incredible clients and partnerships in architecture, and the projects we're doing, you only imagine 10 years ago. So, I think that's, fortunately for us, we're doing the projects you ask about.
Yeah, you're already doing them. So all of them.
And I'm really, it will be a lovely conversation in 3 years' time because they'll be finished, and it'll be a new conversation. They're all public buildings.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I think it's always fascinating, both of those things come back to community and people and experiences. and engaging the land in at the same time. It's not.
But the other thing, and I mentioned it earlier, and I'm sorry to butt in, but
No, it's good.
the other thing which is so important, particularly in the first project, is the word time. Like, our understanding of time is an educated one. It's not an intuitive one. I mean, it starts with the clock and it starts with the seasons, but time is infinite. Time has no beginning and no end. And the project in the desert has that quality. And that's playing a significant role in my thinking now. How does one understand time in a building? And I'm not talking about timelessness.
No.
I'm talking about time. Time has an instant and it has a linear progression. But once it's gone, it's gone. So it overlaps with imagination time. So that's the wonderful sort of point at which we're discovering buildings now.
So are you a daydreamer?
Too much. I thought I'd drift away from the habit, but if anything, I'd become worse. Well, not worse, but better.
Better. Well, it's an interesting thing. You know, people, and I know I do this, use busyness as a vehicle to not always be present. And there's you're talking about the time piece of it. It becomes a, well, I'm striving to make it a habit to take time and make, you know, the moments out of that time in the daydreaming sense. And often I need activity so that it can calm the farm a bit so that I can take time. Now, I'm not so good at just sitting still, but, you know, I'll go and wash the car or something like that. My mind ranges through so many things, or I'll mow the lawn or whatever, just something that occupies some movement, and then my mind can go play and daydream. And I think again, in this moment, it's all too easy to fill that with entertainment or with something because of our phones and other devices, and an expectation there. And just to have those
try filling it with thinking.
Yeah. Absolutely. Peter, thank you so much.
No worries.
Absolutely brilliant, mate. I can't wait to publish this, and we'll publish a bunch of pictures that we didn't talk about with this. And I would encourage everybody to look at Dimensions X and consider that as your next home, no matter what sort of scale you're thinking, because it is done with thoughtfulness for the land and for yourself and for the future. I think that's really important. And then also get on Bondo Mermaids and vote for Peter and his team, because it is truly sensational. And go and discover some of his buildings. There's some stories in there. In every building, there's a deep story. And I think you've got that from my chat with him today. Peter, brilliant, mate. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. See you soon.
Cheers. Thank you for tuning into our conversation. I hope it left you both informed and inspired. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen, and please don't hesitate to share your design thoughts with me. It's always a joy to hear from you. If you're like me and crave a deeper dive into design thinking, coupled with a love for travel and adventure, consider one of my architectural adventures. Join me and some of my wonderful design friends and embark on a journey of a lifetime. Apply for an unforgettable design experience at adrianramsey.com With our clients spanning the globe, I firmly believe behind every great project are great people. If you're a great person and seeking to turn your dream into a reality, I'd be honored to design your home with you. Why not join the ranks of our exceptional clients and let's make your heart sing? Reach out to me at studio@ardesignhouse.com. That's studio@ardesignhouse.com, and let's get a conversation going and make your heart sing.